For 3,000 years, the people of the Nile had bowed to many gods. Amun, hidden and powerful, Osiris, lord of the dead, Isis, mother of magic, a whole family of divine beings, each with their own temple, their own priests, their own place in the order of things. Then, in the 14th year before the Common Era began to be counted this way, a young pharaoh climbed onto the throne of Egypt and decided that all of it, every god, every temple, every priest, would be erased. His name was Amenhotep, but he wouldn't keep that name for long. Picture the Temple of Karnak before the change. Vast stone halls, columns thicker than a grown man could wrap his arms around, dim light filtering through narrow openings high above, incense curling through the air like slow grey smoke. Priests moving in silence, feet bare against cool stone floors worn smooth by 100 generations before them. This was the world into which a boy grew, a boy who would become the most radical ruler Egypt had ever known. Historians still argue, even now, about what happened inside his mind. Was it faith, a genuine vision of one true God, the sun disk he called the Aten? Or was it something colder, a calculated grab for power, stripping the priesthood of Amun of their wealth, their land, their influence over the throne? We may never know for certain, but we know what he did. He built a new city from nothing, in the desert. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today, archaeologists call the ruins Amarna. He abandoned Thebes, abandoned the old capital, and marched his entire court, his family, his officials, thousands of ordinary people, out into empty desert land that no pharaoh had claimed before. A blank page, he said, a place with no old god watching over it, a place that belonged only to the Aten. And he changed his own name too. Amenhotep, which means Amun is satisfied, became Akhenaten, which means effective for the Aten. Tonight, we walk through that city, through the eyes of the people who lived there. Not kings, not priests of the new order. Ordinary Egyptians, a stonecutter's daughter, a scribe's apprentice, a soldier's wife. People who woke up one morning under one set of gods and were told, quite suddenly, that everything they believed was now forbidden. Let yourself sink into the sand and silence of Amarna. Let the weight of the day fall away. This is a story of change, of upheaval, of a world remade by one man's will. Rest now and listen. The journey to Amarna took days. Imagine it, a long column of people and animals moving across the desert, dust rising behind them like a slow brown river, ox carts loaded with furniture, grain, tools, donkeys straining under baskets of pottery and linen, soldiers marching at the edges, their spears catching the sunlight. Somewhere, in the middle of that column, walked a girl named Merit, 12 years old, the daughter of a stonecutter who had been ordered, not asked, ordered, to bring his skills to the new capital. Merit did not understand, not fully, why they were leaving. Her grandmother had wept when they packed the small shrine to Bastet that had sat in their home for 3 generations. "It is forbidden now," her father had said quietly, almost like an apology. "We cannot bring her with us. The old gods, left behind like furniture, too heavy to carry." When they finally arrived, when the city rose out of the shimmering heat of the desert horizon, Merit remembers stopping. Everyone stopped, because there was nothing there. Not yet. Foundations marked in the sand. Teams of workers already digging. already laying the first stones. A city built in a place where, until a few months before, only scorpions and wind had lived. This was Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, and it was being built at a speed that seemed almost impossible, because the pharaoh wanted to live here as soon as possible, wanted his god to have a home before the next flood season came. Merit's family was given a small plot of land near the workers' village on the eastern edge of the city. The house was not finished. Mud brick walls, still damp. No roof yet on 2 of the rooms. Sand blowing in through window openings that had no shutters. They slept that first night under the stars, her mother's arm around her, listening to the distant sound of hammers and chisels continuing even after dark, because the deadline set by the palace did not pause for sunset. In the morning, Merit walked with her father toward the heart of the city, where the great temple of the Aten was rising. And here is what struck her most, what she would remember for the rest of her life. This temple had no roof. Every temple she had ever known, the temple of Bastet in her home village, the great halls of Karnak she had glimpsed once from a distance, these were dark, enclosed spaces, places where a god's presence was hidden, mysterious, approached through shadow and incense smoke. But the great temple of the Aten was open to the sky, open courtyards, one after another, offering tables laid out under open air, so that the sun itself, the god itself, could shine directly down upon the offerings. No hiding, no mystery, just light, endless light, pouring onto altar after altar after altar. Her father did not need to explain the meaning to her. She felt it, standing there, squinting up into the brightness. The old gods lived in darkness. This new god lived only in light. They said the pharaoh himself would come to this temple every day at dawn to greet the sun as it rose, and again at dusk to bid it farewell. He believed, or claimed to believe, that the Aten's rays were not just light, but living hands, reaching down to touch the earth, to touch the king and his family directly. No priest needed as an intermediary, no hidden god in a dark sanctuary, just the sun and the king, and the rays connecting them like invisible threads. For a stonecutter's daughter standing in the dust of a half-built city, none of this quite made sense yet. But she would learn. Everyone in Akhetaten would learn, over the months and years that followed, what it meant to live in the light of one God, and what it cost to leave the old ones behind. Rest here a moment. Let the image settle, a city of light rising from empty sand, and know that tomorrow we return. 3 months passed. The half-built house grew a roof. The temple gained its outer walls, and Amarna, slowly, began to breathe like a living city instead of a construction site. Merit woke each morning to the sound of her mother grinding grain against a stone quern, the rhythmic scrape and thud carrying through the thin mud brick walls. Outside, the streets, not yet paved, still packed dirt marked with cartwheel grooves, filled with the low hum of a city finding its rhythm. Donkeys braying, water carriers calling out prices, children weaving between the legs of adults, chasing something only they could see. Her father left before sunrise most days, walking toward the limestone quarries east of the city, where blocks were still being cut for the temple's inner sanctuaries. He came home each evening covered in pale dust, his hands cracked, his shoulders bent in a way they had not been before they left their old village. The work here was relentless. The pharaoh wanted his city finished and finished quickly, and there was no room in his vision for rest. But there was, at least, a market. Merit loved the market most of all. It sprawled along a wide street near the river, where boats from Thebes and beyond brought grain, oil, pottery, cloth, dried fish, sweet dates. Merchants called out over each other, haggling in loud, cheerful voices that seemed, for a moment, untouched by any of the strangeness settling over the rest of the city. Here, at least, life felt almost normal. A woman selling onions, a man repairing sandals, a boy her own age, an apprentice scribe, sitting cross-legged with a writing board balanced on his knees, practicing symbols with a reed brush dipped in soot-black ink. His name was Nakht. She would come to know him well in the months that followed, though at the time, all she knew was that he made her laugh, and that his father worked in the House of Life, the great library and scriptorium attached to the palace, where scribes copied texts, recorded harvests, and, increasingly, rewrote the old religious hymns to remove any mention of Amun. That last part, Nakht did not tell her at first. It was not something spoken about loosely, even among children, because here was the truth beneath the market's cheerful noise. The truth Merit was only beginning to understand. Akhenaten's revolution was not gentle. It was not simply the addition of a new god alongside the old ones, the way Egypt had absorbed foreign gods before, folding them comfortably into its already crowded pantheon. This was different. This was erasure. Royal decrees had gone out and were still going out, ordering workers across Egypt, not just in Amarna, but in every city, every temple, every tomb, to chisel the name of Amun out of stone, to scrape it from monuments that had stood for 1,000 years, to destroy, physically and permanently, any trace of the god who had once been called king of all gods. Merit's grandmother, left behind in their old village, had written to them once, a rare letter dictated to a scribe, since she could not write herself, describing soldiers arriving at the temple of Amun near their old home, describing the sound of chisels against stone, hour after hour, as the god's name was cut away from walls that had stood since before her own grandmother was born, describing the priests, stripped of their positions, their income, their purpose, standing in the temple courtyard with nowhere left to go. At night, lying beside her sleeping sister, she would sometimes hear her parents talking in low voices after the lamp was extinguished. Her father's quarry work, the endless deadlines, the pharaoh's growing demands, her mother's worry about food prices, about whether the harvests from the old temple lands, now seized by the crown since the priests no longer managed them, would be distributed fairly, or hoarded by officials loyal only to the new order. Outside, beyond their walls, the desert stretched dark and silent in every direction. The boundary stones the pharaoh had ordered, carved into the cliffs marking the edges of his sacred city, promising he would never leave this place, never abandon the horizon of his god. He believed, it seemed, that he was building something eternal. Rest now, in the quiet between his certainty and the world's uncertainty. And when you wake again in our story, we will step inside the House of Life, where Nakht spends his days learning to write a language that is itself being rewritten. The House of Life stood near the palace, a long, cool building of mud brick and limestone, its interior divided into rooms where papyrus scrolls lined shelves from floor to ceiling, Some scrolls, centuries old, their edges soft and dark with handling, others freshly made, still smelling faintly of the reeds they were pressed from. Nukt had been coming here since he was 7 years old, trailing behind his father through the entrance each morning, past the guards who barely glanced at them anymore, into a large central room where a dozen boys sat cross-legged on reed mats, writing boards balanced on their knees. He remembered still the first hymn he had ever been made to copy, a hymn to Amun, the hidden one, the breath of life. He remembered the careful curves of the hieroglyphs, the patience it took to make each symbol exact, because a scribe's work had to be perfect, had to be beautiful, had to honor the God it described. Now, 4 years later, that same hymn was forbidden to even speak aloud. The senior scribe who oversaw the boys' lessons, an old man named Annie, had grown quieter over the past year. He no longer told the old stories he used to tell, the myths of Osiris and the underworld, the tales of Isis searching for her husband's scattered body. Instead, each morning began the same way now. Annie would unroll a new hymn, one of the growing collection of verses praising the Aten, and the boys would copy it line by line, their reed brushes moving across fresh papyrus. Nukt had memorized much of the great hymn to the Aten without meaning to, simply from copying it so many times. He could recite, in his mind, the lines describing the sun rising over the horizon, filling every land with its beauty, the way all creatures woke and stretched and began their day because of its light, the way fish leapt in the river and birds flew from their nests and flowers opened, all because the Aten had returned to the sky. It was, Nukt privately thought, a beautiful hymn. He did not tell his father this exactly, because his father's feelings about the new religion were complicated in ways an 11-year-old boy could sense but not fully untangle. His father served the House of Life because it was his profession, his family's profession for 3 generations. But some evenings walking home, his father would grow quiet, passing the old empty precinct where a small shrine to Thoth, god of writing and wisdom, had once stood. The shrine was gone now, the shrine to Thoth, dismantled along with so many others, though scribes still, in whispered moments, credited their skill to a god they were no longer permitted to name. Nukt asked him once, carefully, whether it was wrong to still think of Thoth, even quietly, even in the privacy of one's own mind, when the pharaoh had declared only the Aten should be worshipped. His father had been silent a long moment before answering. "The heart believes what it believes," he said finally. "The chisel only changes what is written on stone." Nukt did not fully understand this answer at 11, though he would understand it more in later years, as he grew older and watched the strange machinery of Akhenaten's Egypt continue to turn around him. Because life at the House of Life was not only about hymns to the Aten, it was also about the enormous, unglamorous work of running a kingdom. Scribes still recorded grain shipments, still tracked cattle counts, still copied diplomatic letters arriving from foreign kings. Letters that Nukt was sometimes allowed to watch being translated. Exotic seals pressed into clay tablets from places called Babylon and Mitanni and Hatti, kingdoms far beyond anything Nukt could picture. Some of these letters, he noticed over the months, grew increasingly worried in tone. Foreign vassal kings, rulers of small territories that owed loyalty to Egypt, wrote pleading for military help against enemies, against rival kingdoms encroaching on their borders. And the responses, or rather, the lack of responses, troubled the older scribes. Nakht once overheard two senior officials speaking quietly near the archive room, their voices tight with a frustration they did not bother hiding fully. "The king does not answer them," one said. "He builds temples to the light while our allies beg for soldiers." Nakht did not know then how much this mattered. He was 11, and the world beyond Amarna's boundary stones felt as distant and unreal as the myths he was no longer allowed to copy. His days were filled with ink and papyrus, and the particular satisfaction of a well-formed hieroglyph, with market visits alongside his father, with a girl named Merit, whose laughter he had begun, secretly, to look forward to hearing. But somewhere beyond the horizon, his father's god ruled so completely. In Babylon, in Mitanni, in a dozen small kingdoms along Egypt's borders, trouble was gathering. Quietly, slowly, the way trouble often does, before anyone is ready to name it. Rest now, in the scratch of reed brush against papyrus, in the quiet hum of a scriptorium full of boys learning a new language for an old world. When we return, we will follow Merit and Nakht together into the heart of the city to see the royal family as the people of Amarna saw them. Not gods themselves, but close enough to make ordinary hearts uncertain how to feel. It happened perhaps once a month, sometimes less. A herald would move through the streets at dawn, calling out that the royal family would appear that day at the window of appearance, the balcony on the palace's facade, where the pharaoh and his family sometimes showed themselves to the people. On these mornings, Amarna transformed. Merit's mother would insist on braiding her hair properly, tying it back with a strip of blue linen saved for occasions like this. Nakht's father closed the house of life early, and the whole scriptorium spilled out into the streets, joining the growing crowds moving toward the wide plaza before the palace. Merit found Nakht in the crowd that morning, as she often did now, the two of them slipping through the press of bodies until they found a spot near enough to see clearly. The plaza filled slowly. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Quarry workers, still dusted pale from the morning's labor, stood shoulder to shoulder with palace officials in fine linen. Even the poorest families in Amarna, the ones who lived in the crowded, hastily built quarters near the city's edge, came to watch, because this was the closest most of them would ever come to seeing their king. When the royal family finally appeared on the balcony above, a hush moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Merit had never seen anything like it. Later, she would struggle to describe it properly to her grandmother, in the rare letters that passed between Amarna and their old village. Akhenaten stood at the balcony's edge, his figure strange and elongated in a way that unsettled her at first. A long face, a curving belly, limbs that seemed stretched beyond what she thought a body should look like. The royal artists had begun rendering him this way in every statue, every relief carved into the temple walls, and now seeing him in life, Merit could not tell if he truly looked this way, or if years of seeing his image carved this way had simply taught her eyes what to expect. Beside him stood Nefertiti, his queen, and here Merit found herself unable to look away. Nefertiti's crown, tall and blue, caught the morning light. Her face, calm and striking, turned toward the crowd with an expression that seemed, Even from this distance, deliberate, composed, a queen fully aware of every eye upon her, and between them and around them, their daughters. 6 of them at various ages, some still small enough to be held by nursemaids, others standing solemnly beside their parents in miniature versions of royal dress. What struck Merit most, though, was what happened next. Akhenaten raised his arms toward the sun, and the crowd, as one, dropped to their knees, foreheads pressed against the warm stone of the plaza. Merit felt Nacht beside her do the same, and she followed. The 2 of them kneeling together in the dust among thousands of others. From this position, she could just make out Akhenaten's voice, carried by the particular stillness of a crowd, this large reciting words from the hymn Nacht had described copying so many times. Words about the sun's rays reaching down like living hands, connecting the god directly to the king, and through the king, to all of Egypt. Later, walking home through streets slowly returning to their ordinary rhythm, Nacht voiced something Merit had been turning over privately in her own mind. "Everyone loves him at moments like this," he said quietly, "but everyone needs him too. That is different from love." Merit did not fully understand what he meant, not then, but she remembered his words months later, when the harvest came in thinner than expected, and grain prices in the market began, slowly, to rise, and people began in low voices, careful voices, to ask why the granaries, once managed by the temple of Amun, now controlled by royal officials loyal only to the crown, seemed less full than they used to be. Rest now, beneath the memory of a king raising his arms to a god only he could fully reach, and know that even a splendid morning in the sun casts long shadows by evening. The trouble began, as trouble so often does, with the river. The flood that year arrived late, and when it came thin, the waters rising less than the farmers along the Nile had hoped, leaving fields at the edges of the floodplain dry and cracked, instead of blanketed in the rich black silt that made Egypt's harvests possible year after year. Merit did not understand any of this at first, not in the way the adults around her seemed to. She only understood that her mother's face grew tighter each week at the market, that the price of bread had risen twice since the season began, that the fish sellers along the river had less to offer and charged more for what little they had. Her father, coming home each evening from the quarries, brought fragments of talk he had overheard among the other workers. Talk of the old temple granaries, once managed by the priests of Amun across Egypt, vast storehouses that had, for generations, served as a buffer against exactly this kind of thin harvest. Grain set aside in good years, released in lean ones, an ancient system that had kept famine at bay through countless difficult seasons. But those granaries now belonged to the crown. The priesthood that once managed them, distributed them, understood the old careful balance of storage and release, had been stripped of their positions, scattered, silenced. In their place stood royal officials, men appointed for loyalty rather than experience, men more skilled in navigating court politics than in the patient, unglamorous work of managing a kingdom's grain reserves. Nacht's father spoke of it once, quietly, in the House of Life, to another senior scribe, not realizing Nacht was close enough in the next room to hear. The old system was not perfect, he said, but it worked because it did not depend on one man's judgment. Now everything depends on one man's judgment, and one man cannot see everything. Nakht turned this thought over for days afterward. Meanwhile, from the House of Life's diplomatic archive, more letters continued arriving from Egypt's vassal kings in distant lands, and Nakht now permitted small tasks in the archive itself, occasionally glimpsed their contents as senior scribes prepared responses. One letter, from a king in a place called Byblos, described his city under siege, his messengers to Egypt going unanswered for so long that he questioned whether they had arrived at all. Another, from a ruler further north, described enemy forces advancing while he waited, month after month, for the Egyptian soldiers he had been promised. The senior scribes drafted careful, measured responses to these pleas, but Nakht noticed something troubling in how rarely troops or resources actually followed. The pharaoh's attention, it seemed, remained fixed almost entirely inward, on his city, his temple, his god, his family, while at Egypt's edges, the vast web of alliances and loyalties that previous pharaohs had spent generations building began, thread by thread, to fray. None of this reached the ordinary people of Amarna directly, of course. Merit knew nothing of Byblos or its besieged king. What she knew was simpler and closer to home. Bread cost more than it once did, and her mother's shoulders carried a tension that had not been there when they first arrived in this bright new city of light. One evening, walking together along the river after the day's heat had finally broken, Merit and Nakht passed a small gathering near the docks, workers speaking in voices lower than usual, glancing around before continuing their conversation. Merit caught only fragments. Something about wages unpaid for 2 months. Something about a foreman who had been dismissed for asking too many questions about missing grain shipments. Nakht took her hand, an unfamiliar gesture between them, and pulled her gently along, away from the gathering. "Some conversations are not meant for us to hear," he said. Not yet. That night, lying awake, Merit thought about her grandmother's letters from their old village, about priests standing empty-handed in temple courtyards, about chisels scraping ancient names from ancient stone. She thought about the boundary stones ringing Amarna, the ones the pharaoh had sworn would mark an eternal city, and wondered, for the first time, whether anything built this quickly, on foundations this new, could truly last as long as a king's promise claimed it would. Outside her window, the desert stretched dark and endless, indifferent to kings and gods alike, patient in the way only sand and centuries can be patient. Rest now in the space between promise and doubt, and when we return, we will step further into the whispered corners of Amarna, where discontent begins to take a shape that even a king's radiant sun cannot fully illuminate. Winter came to Amarna, though winter in this part of the world meant only a gentleness in the air, mornings cool enough to make the linen blankets welcome, evenings that arrived a little earlier, painting the desert cliffs in deepening shades of amber and rose. By now, Merit was 13, and the city that had once seemed so strange and unfinished to her had become simply home. She knew its streets the way she had once known her old village. She knew which bread seller gave honest measure and which shorted his customers when he thought no one was counting. She knew the particular hour of afternoon when the light through the unfinished temple courtyards turned gold enough to make even tired quarry workers pause and look up. But she also knew now to listen carefully, to notice things. She noticed that Nefertiti, The queen whose calm, striking face she had watched from the plaza that first year appeared less often at the window of appearance. When she did appear, something in her bearing seemed different, though Merit could not have named exactly what. Rumours moved through the market like ripples across still water. Some said the queen had fallen from favour. Others said she had taken on new powers, new titles, that she now ruled beside the king with an authority no queen before her had held. Still others whispered, more quietly, that something had happened within the palace walls that no one outside them fully understood, and that the truth would likely never reach ordinary ears like Merit's. Nakht, older now too, spent more time in the archive proper, trusted with small but real tasks. He told her, in low voices during their evening walks along the river, fragments of what he observed. The diplomatic letters had grown more desperate. A vassal king in the north, one who had written faithfully to Pharaoh for years requesting aid, had finally stopped writing altogether. The senior scribes did not say aloud what this silence likely meant, but Nakht understood from the tightness around their eyes when the matter came up, that they feared the worst. A kingdom lost, an ally overrun, a piece of Egypt's carefully built influence in the wider world, quietly, permanently gone. And still, the temple of the Aten continued rising. Still, new hymns were composed, copied, distributed to shrines across the city. Still, the pharaoh appeared each dawn to greet his god, his devotion by every account, undimmed by the troubles gathering at the edges of his kingdom. Merit's father spoke less at dinner these days. The quarry work had slowed, not because the temple was finished, but because certain shipments of high-quality stone, promised from quarries further south, had simply stopped arriving, their transport disrupted by troubles no one in Amarna fully explained. Workers waited, some days, with nothing to do, their wages growing later and thinner with each passing month. She thought about Nakht's words from months before. Everyone needs him. That is different from love. She thought about her grandmother's garden, a place she remembered now only in fragments. The smell of herbs, the particular blue of the small shrine to Bastet that had once sat beside the door, the shrine they had left behind because the old gods, suddenly, had become forbidden things. Above her, the stars spread across the sky in their ancient, indifferent patterns. The same stars, she realized, that had watched over Egypt long before Akhenaten, and would likely watch over it long after he was gone too, rest now, beneath that same wide sky. And when we return, the tensions gathering quietly beneath Amarna's golden surface will begin at last to surface. It began with whispers from travellers. Merchants arriving from the north spoke of a sickness moving through the lands beyond Egypt's borders, a fever that struck suddenly, that spread through households and camps and cities with a speed that outran any remedy the healers of those distant kingdoms could offer. At first, these stories felt distant to the people of Amarna, the way stories of foreign wars and foreign troubles always felt distant, spoken of in the market between more pressing concerns like bread prices and unpaid wages. But distant things, Merit was learning, had a way of arriving eventually. By the time the first fevers appeared within Amarna itself, whispered about in low voices near the docks where foreign traders unloaded their goods, the sickness had already been moving through the wider world for what the diplomatic letters, according to Nakht, suggested was well over a year. Kingdoms to the north had written to Pharaoh's court, describing entire households lost, describing a plague so severe that some rulers begged not for soldiers now, but for physicians, for any remedy Egypt's renowned healers might offer. Nak told Merit one evening as they sat near the river that he had seen a letter from a foreign king describing his own land as being consumed by this sickness, describing his desperation so plainly that even the senior scribes, hardened by years of reading formal diplomatic language, had gone quiet reading it aloud. And now it was here, in Amarna, in the city built to be untouchable, protected, blessed by the direct gaze of the Aten itself. The first deaths in the city were quiet, contained to a few households near the harbour, families who had taken in traders passing through. But within weeks, the fever spread further into the crowded workers' quarters, where families lived close together in small mud-brick rooms, where a single sickness could pass from one household to the next as easily as a shared cup of water. Merit's family was spared at first, though fear settled over their household like a physical weight. Her mother stopped sending her to the market alone. Her father, when he came home from the quarries, described entire teams of workers reduced by half within a single week, coffins being prepared faster than the carpenters could properly finish them. The temple of the Aten, so recently a place of golden certainty, became instead a place people flocked to with a new and desperate kind of prayer. Not the calm, practiced devotion of ordinary worship, but something raw. Families kneeling in the open courtyards, faces upturned toward a sun that offered light, but, it seemed, no protection from what moved invisibly through their city. Nacht confided to Merit quietly something that troubled him deeply. In the old religion, there had been Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing both, a fierce deity whose priests knew rituals specifically meant to turn aside exactly this kind of sickness. There had been Thoth, god of medicine as much as writing, invoked by physicians for centuries. But those gods, those priesthoods, those accumulated centuries of ritual knowledge had been dismantled, scattered, forbidden. The Aten, for all its radiant light, had no tradition of healing to offer. It was too new, too singular, too recently invented to have accumulated the kind of layered, practical wisdom that older religions built up slowly, generation after generation, through trial and memory. Some healers in the city, Nuck told her, had begun quietly, carefully, returning to old remedies, old invocations, even the names of forbidden gods, whispered under breath while preparing medicines, because desperate families cared less, in that moment, about religious law than about saving a child's life. The sickness passed, eventually, through her household without claiming anyone, though it left the city changed. Fewer children in the streets, fewer voices in the market, a quietness that had not been there before, settling over Amarna's golden temples and half-finished palaces like dust after a long drought. And in the palace itself, rumours began, spreading even faster than the fever had. Rumours that the sickness had reached even the royal family, that one of the 6 princesses, still small enough to be carried by her nursemaids at the window of appearance those years before, had fallen ill and not recovered. Even Nefertiti herself, some whispered, though no one could say for certain, had succumbed to what no crown, no royal blood, no closeness to a god could protect against. Rest now, in the quiet that follows a fever's passing, and know that even a city built on radiant certainty cannot outrun the oldest, most patient truths of human life. Merit noticed it first in small things. The market, once loud with haggling and laughter, grew quieter, vendors calling out prices with less enthusiasm, customers moving through their errands with heads bowed a little lower than before. The temple courtyards, once filled with the golden certainty of morning worship, now held a different quality of silence. Not devotion exactly, but something closer to exhaustion. Nakt's father spoke rarely now of the great hymns, the beautiful verses about light and life that had once filled his conversations. Instead, the house of life busied itself with quieter, sadder work, recording the dead, tallying losses among the palace staff, drafting the careful, formal language required for royal mourning. The rumors about the royal family, it turned out, held some truth, though the full picture remained, as always, obscured behind palace walls that ordinary Amarna residents could never fully see past. A princess had indeed died, one of the 6 who had once stood beside their parents at the window of appearance, small and solemn in miniature royal dress. Merit remembered watching that same girl years before, remembered the particular way she used to peek out from behind her nursemaid's legs at the crowd below. Whether Nefertiti herself had also fallen ill, whether she still lived within the palace, or had vanished from public life for reasons the city could only guess at, no one in the market could say with certainty. She simply stopped appearing. The window of appearance itself, once a monthly event that transformed the whole city, grew rarer, then rarer still, until whole seasons passed without the herald's call moving through the streets at dawn. Akhenaten, when he did appear, seemed changed to those who saw him. Nakt's father, present at a diplomatic reception in the palace that Nakt was permitted to hear about only second-hand, described a king who moved and spoke with a weight that had not been there in the earlier, more vigorous years of his reign. Whether this was grief or illness, or simply the accumulated exhaustion of building an entire religious revolution against the resistance of a whole kingdom's ancient habits, no one could say for certain. Meanwhile, beyond Amarna's boundary stones, Egypt's troubles continued largely unaddressed. The diplomatic archive, Nakt told Merit one evening, now held an entire shelf of letters that had simply gone unanswered, their pleas for soldiers, for grain, for basic acknowledgement, absorbed into silence. Kingdoms that had once looked to Egypt as protector and ally now made their own arrangements, sought their own alliances, understanding, in the practical way distant rulers understand such things, that Amarna's pharaoh had little attention left to spare for anyone beyond his own sacred horizon. Nakt hesitated before answering. "I think," he said finally, "that even inside the palace, some people have begun preparing for what comes after all this. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes." Merit thought of her grandmother's small shrine to Bastet, packed away years before, forbidden and unspoken since their arrival in this city of light. She wondered, walking beside Nak through streets grown quiet with grief and uncertainty, whether shrines like that one still existed, hidden away in homes across Egypt, waiting patiently, the way the old gods themselves seemed to wait, for a season of favor to return. Above them, the sun continued its steady arc across the sky, indifferent, as it always had been, to whichever names humans chose to call it by. Rest now, in this long, quiet season of grief and waiting. And when we return, the boy Nakht spoke of will step, at last, into the center of our story. His name, when Merit first heard it spoken aloud in more than a whisper, was Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, a name that bound him, just as his father's name bound the whole family, to the singular god of the sun disk. He was young, still a child by most measures, though royal children in Egypt grew into their responsibilities faster than ordinary ones. Nakht had glimpsed him only once, from a respectful distance, during a ceremony at the House of Life, where scribes had been summoned to record some minor royal proclamation. A small figure, Nakht described, solemn beyond his years, flanked by attendants who watched him with a carefulness that seemed to Nakht less like ordinary royal protocol and more like something more deliberate. Preparation, perhaps, or protection. The boy's mother, it was whispered in the House of Life's quieter corners, was not Nefertiti at all, but a lesser royal wife, a woman whose name appeared rarely in official records, her position in the palace hierarchy modest compared to the queen's radiant prominence. This detail mattered, Nakht's father explained once quietly, because it meant the boy existed somewhat apart from the central drama of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's very public, very visible devotion to the Aten. He had grown up, it seemed, slightly to the side of his father's revolution, close enough to be shaped by it, but not so close as to be entirely consumed by it. Merit found herself thinking about this often in the months that followed, about what it might mean to grow up as a child of the most radical religious upheaval Egypt had ever known, and yet to grow up also, hearing perhaps quieter voices, old nursemaids, perhaps, or attendants who remembered the world before Akhenaten, who might have whispered carefully of gods whose names were no longer supposed to be spoken. Merit was 15 now, old enough that her mother had begun, gently but persistently, raising the subject of marriage. There was a young man, a friend of her father's from the quarries, whose family had expressed interest. Merit had met him only briefly, a quiet, capable young stonecutter named Phahemnetja, kind in his manner, careful in his speech, entirely unremarkable in the way that steady, decent people often are. She found herself in these months thinking less about kings and gods and more about her own life, her own choices, narrowing and sharpening the way a young woman's future often does at exactly this age. Nakht, too, was changing, growing into the quiet confidence of a young scribe nearly finished with his training, beginning to take on responsibilities that would soon make him a fully recognized member of the House of Life. Merit felt something tighten in her chest, though she could not have said exactly why. Perhaps because a city that had known so much upheaval already sensed, instinctively, that more was coming. Perhaps because even a girl who had grown up almost entirely within Akhenaten's reign understood, in some deep and wordless way, that kings were not meant to rule forever, and that the passing of this particular king would mean something enormous for the strange, radiant, fragile world he had built. Above them, the Nile moved on, patient and indifferent, carrying its water toward the sea, exactly as it had before Akhenaten's reign began, and exactly as it would continue to do long after his reign ended. Rest now, in the quiet uncertainty of a city waiting to learn what comes next. And when we return, we will witness the ending of one king's radiant vision and the first uncertain steps toward whatever might follow. Nakht found her that evening, his face pale in a way she had rarely seen. The House of Life had already begun the enormous, sorrowful work required of a pharaoh's death, the careful documents, the formal proclamations, the beginning of what would become a 70-day mourning and preparation period before burial, a process Nakht himself, now old enough to assist with real responsibility, would help record. "He is to be buried here," Nakht told her quietly, "in the royal tomb cut into the eastern cliffs beyond the city. His father built this place to be eternal. Perhaps, in death, he finally gets to test that promise." Merit thought of the boundary stones ringing the city, the pharaoh's carved vow. To never merit thought of the boundary stones ringing the city, the pharaoh's carved vow to never leave this sacred horizon. In death, at least, he would keep that promise, whatever became of the living city around his tomb. The mourning period stretched through the following weeks in a strange, suspended atmosphere. The temple courtyards, so recently quiet with weary routine, filled again, though now with grief rather than devotion. Priests of the Aten, the only priesthood the city had ever known, performed the elaborate rituals required to prepare a king's soul for its journey. Rituals invented, Merit realized, only 17 years before, untested by the accumulated weight of centuries that older Egyptian funerary traditions carried. And beneath the grief, quietly, carefully, a different kind of activity had already begun. Nakht told her, in hushed tones during one of their evening walks, that senior officials throughout the palace and priesthood were meeting more frequently now, their conversations guarded even from trusted scribes like himself. The boy, Tutankhaten, not yet 10 years old, stood now as Pharaoh's heir, far too young to rule alone. Advisors would govern in his name, at least for years to come, men whose true loyalties and intentions remained, to someone as young as Nakht, frustratingly unclear. What was clear, even to Merit, watching from the ordinary vantage point of the market and the mud-brick streets, was that something fundamental had shifted the moment the old king's breath stopped. The absolute certainty that had defined Akhenaten's entire reign, the singular, unquestionable devotion to one god channeled through one king, could not simply transfer intact to a child not yet old enough to understand the full weight of what his father had built. Within months, whispers reached even Merit's household, carried home by her father from conversations among the quarry workers, that the boy king's advisors had begun quietly restoring old titles, old positions, even old temple lands, to priests who had spent years stripped of purpose and income. Nothing official yet, nothing announced with the grand proclamation that had accompanied Akhenaten's original revolution, but small threads, carefully pulled, that suggested a slow, deliberate unraveling of everything the old king had woven into place. Merit's mother, hearing this news, said little, though Merit noticed her hand move briefly to touch the small space near her chest where, years ago, a simple pendant to Bastet had once hung, before it was packed away with the rest of their forbidden household shrine. "Perhaps," her mother said quietly one evening, not looking at anyone directly, "we will be permitted to go home again, someday. Perhaps this strange, beautiful, difficult city will not need to hold us forever." Merit was not certain, hearing this, whether she wanted to return to the old village she barely remembered, or whether Amarna, despite everything, despite the fear and grief and uncertainty of these recent years, had quietly become the only home she truly knew. Above the morning city, the sun continued its steady arc, exactly as it always had, exactly as the old hymns had always described, indifferent in the end to whichever name humans chose to give it, or whichever king claimed to hold its singular favor. Rest now in this long, uncertain season between one reign's ending and whatever comes next. And when we return, we will watch as the city Merit has always known begins, slowly and irreversibly, to come undone. That world was returning. Nacht confirmed it in the weeks that followed, his access to the House of Life's archives giving him a clearer view than most of what was actually happening. Royal decrees, carefully worded, began restoring the old temples. Workers who had once been ordered to chisel Amun's name away from ancient walls were now sent quietly to carve it back in. The great temple complexes at Thebes, dismantled and defunded for nearly 2 decades, began receiving royal resources again. Priests reinstated, rituals resumed that had not been performed openly since before Merit was born. And Amarna itself, the radiant city of light, built from nothing in the desert, sworn by boundary stones to stand eternal, began, slowly, to empty. It happened gradually enough that Merit almost didn't notice at first. A family here, packing their belongings onto a boat bound for Thebes. A workshop there, its craftsmen relocated to serve the newly reopened temples elsewhere. The House of Life itself, Nakat told her with a heaviness in his voice she had not heard from him before, would eventually move its entire operation, its scrolls, its scribes, its accumulated records, back to the old capital. "We are going too," he told her one evening, as they sat together near the river for what both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, might be one of their last evenings in this particular place. "My father has been reassigned. The House of Life cannot exist properly in a city no one intends to maintain." Merit felt something close around her heart, hearing this. She thought of her own family, her father's uncertain quarry work, now slowing further as the temple project lost its royal urgency entirely. She thought of her mother's quiet hope, spoken months before, that they might someday return home. Merit reached for his hand, the same gesture he had once used to pull her gently away from a dangerous conversation years before, when they were still children navigating a city neither of them had chosen to call home. "Then we will have to find each other again," she said. Somehow. Above them, the sun set behind Amarna's cliffs one final time for the two of them together, painting the abandoned courtyards in the same golden light that had once filled Akhenaten's most fervent hymns, indifferent, as always, to the human stories unfolding beneath it. Rest now, in this quiet parting beneath a fading golden sky. And when we return, we will follow both Merit and Nacht into the uncertain, reshaped Egypt that awaited them beyond the boundary stones of a city already beginning to disappear back into the desert that once gave it birth. Merit grew older in her grandmother's village, raising children of her own beneath the same sycamore trees that had shaded her own childhood memories. She kept the small shrine to Bastet by the door, exactly as her grandmother had, teaching her own daughters the old prayers, the old small rituals, without ever fully explaining to them the strange, radiant city where those same prayers had once been forbidden. Word reached her, occasionally, of the wider world beyond her quiet village. Tutankhamun's reign, though stabilizing Egypt's religious life, remained brief, the young king dying while still barely more than a teenager himself, his own tomb prepared hastily, modestly, nothing like the grand eternal monuments his grandfather and great-grandfather had commissioned in their long secure reigns. Power passed afterward through a series of officials and advisors, men who had served quietly through the Amarna years and its unraveling, each working in his own way to restore Egypt's older, more familiar rhythms. The desert kept its secrets. Long after the people had gone, long after the palaces had emptied and the temples had fallen silent, the wind continued to move across the ruins of Akhetaten. It slipped between broken walls. It whispered through rooms where families had once eaten their evening meals. It lifted small grains of sand and carried them across courtyards where children had once played beneath the endless Egyptian sun. The city had been abandoned almost as quickly as it had been created. What had once been the center of an entire kingdom became something else entirely. A memory. A place people passed without stopping. A place whose name was gradually forgotten. And perhaps that was exactly what the rulers who came after Akhenaten wanted. They wanted the old gods back. They wanted Amun to return to his temples. They wanted priests to speak the familiar prayers again. They wanted Egypt to feel normal. And so the stones of Akhetaten began to disappear. Blocks were removed from temples and palaces. Some were carried away and reused in buildings elsewhere. Others were broken apart and buried beneath new structures. The great city of the Aten slowly became a quarry. Its beautiful walls were dismantled piece by piece. The enormous royal buildings that had once seemed permanent proved to be no more permanent than the people who had lived inside them. Even the name Akhenaten was treated as something dangerous. His memory was not simply forgotten. It was attacked. His statues were broken. His inscriptions were damaged. His monuments were dismantled. His place in the story of Egypt was pushed into darkness. But history has a strange habit. The things people try hardest to erase sometimes become the things that fascinate us most. Centuries passed, then thousands of years. The Nile continued its slow journey toward the Mediterranean. Farmers continued planting their fields. The seasons continued. The sun continued to rise over the eastern horizon every morning, just as it had during Akhenaten's reign. And beneath the sand, Amarna waited. There were no crowds now, no priests, no royal musicians, no soldiers standing beside palace gates, no children running through the streets, only silence, and the occasional cry of a bird passing over the ruins. Imagine walking there at dawn. The sky is still pale. The desert air is cool against your skin. You step carefully over stones that once belonged to someone's home. Perhaps a doorway. Perhaps a kitchen. Perhaps the entrance to a room where a mother once whispered to her sleeping child. You look down, and there, half buried in the dust, is a small piece of painted plaster. Red, blue, yellow. A tiny fragment of a world that once believed it would last forever. You pick it up. For a moment you are holding something that belonged to a person who lived more than 3,000 years ago. You do not know their name. You do not know their dreams. You do not know whether they believed in the Aten with all their heart, or whether they quietly missed the old gods. You only know that they were here. They walked these streets. They touched these walls. They watched the same sun rise over the desert. And then they were gone. That is perhaps the strangest thing about Amarna. Akhenaten wanted to create a city that would be different from everything that came before it. He wanted a new beginning. But what he created eventually became one of the clearest reminders of how impossible it is to escape the past. The old gods returned. The old temples reopened. The old religious traditions survived, and the city of the Aten disappeared. Yet somehow, the idea itself survived. The idea that one ruler could look at thousands of years of tradition and say, "No, we will begin again." That idea still lives in the ruins. Historians have argued over Akhenaten for generations. Some see him as a visionary, a man who reached toward an entirely new understanding of the divine. Others see a ruler obsessed with control, a king who weakened the institutions around him and left Egypt vulnerable while he focused his attention on his religious experiment. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps he was sincere and ambitious. Perhaps he truly believed that the Aten was the only divine power worthy of worship, while also understanding that removing the priests of Amen would place more authority directly into his own hands. Human beings are rarely simple, even pharaohs, especially pharaohs. And maybe that is why Akhenaten remains so fascinating, because beneath the strange statues, beneath the elongated face, beneath the unusual artistic style, there was still a human being, a father, a husband, a ruler, a man who watched the sun rise every morning and believed he had discovered something that everyone else had failed to see. He loved his family. He held his daughters close. He allowed artists to show moments of royal life that earlier Egyptian art had usually kept distant and formal. And yet, the same man could also command an entire population to leave behind traditions that had shaped Egyptian life for generations. His dream was enormous, and when enormous dreams collide with ordinary human lives, someone always pays the price. The stonecutters paid, the farmers paid, the priests paid, the families who had to leave their homes paid. Even the children who had grown up believing in the old gods had to learn new prayers. And when the dream ended, they had to learn the old ones again. Perhaps Merit understood this better than anyone. In the final years of her life, she sometimes sat beneath the shade of a tree and watched the evening light spread across the fields. Her hair had become white. Her hands had become thin. Her daughters had grown old. Her grandchildren had children of their own. The world she had known as a girl existed only in memory. Sometimes she spoke about Amana. Usually, no one listened for very long. To the younger generations, it was simply an old story, a strange story, the story of a strange king who worshipped the sun. But Merit remembered more than that. She remembered the heat of the stones beneath her feet. She remembered the bright walls of the temples. She remembered the sound of workers building new houses. She remembered the excitement that had filled the city in its earliest days. She remembered believing that Amana might last forever. And she remembered Nakht, two children beneath the golden light, two small hands joined together, two voices making a promise they were too young to understand. She never discovered whether the scribe in Thebes truly was him. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it was not. Perhaps Nakht had died years earlier. Perhaps he had become someone completely different. Perhaps he too sometimes remembered a girl named Merit. There was no way to know. And eventually, there was no one left who could answer. That is how history disappears. Not all at once. Not with a final dramatic moment. But slowly. A name is forgotten. A face is forgotten. A voice disappears. A story is told less often. And eventually, even the people who once lived through the great events of history become nothing more than a few lines in a book. Yet sometimes, the silence is broken. In the 19th century, travelers and archaeologists began noticing the strange remains scattered across the desert. They found fragments, and the city of the Aten disappeared. Yet somehow, the idea itself survived. The idea that one ruler could look at thousands of years of tradition and say, "No, we will begin again." That idea still lives in the ruins. Historians have argued over Akhenaten for generations. Some see him as a visionary, a man who reached toward an entirely new understanding of the divine. Others see a ruler obsessed with control, a king who weakened the institutions around him and left Egypt vulnerable while he focused his attention on his religious experiment. Perhaps he was both. Perhaps he was sincere and ambitious. Perhaps he truly believed that the Aten was the only divine power worthy of worship, while also understanding that removing the priests of Amun would place more authority directly into his own hands. Human beings are rarely simple, even pharaohs, especially pharaohs. And maybe that is why Akhenaten remains so fascinating. Because beneath the strange statues, beneath the elongated face, beneath the unusual artistic style, there was still a human being, a father, a husband, a ruler, a man who watched the sun rise every morning and believed he had discovered something that everyone else had failed to see. He loved his family. He held his daughters close. He allowed artists to show moments of royal life that earlier Egyptian art had usually kept distant and formal. And yet, the same man could also command an entire population to leave behind traditions that had shaped Egyptian life for generations. His dream was enormous. And when enormous dreams collide with ordinary human lives, someone always pays the price. The stonecutters paid. The farmers paid. The priests paid. The families who had to leave their homes paid. Even the children who had grown up believing in the old gods had to learn new prayers. And when the dream ended, they had to learn the old ones again. Perhaps Merit understood this better than anyone. In the final years of her life, she sometimes sat beneath the shade of a tree and watched the evening light spread across the fields. Her hair had become white. Her hands had become thin. Her daughters had grown old. Her grandchildren had children of their own. The world she had known as a girl existed only in memory. Sometimes she spoke about Amarna. Usually, no one listened for very long. To the younger generations, it was simply an old story.